the Clark's Nutcracker. The scientific name is Nutcracker columbiana. That's really long and hard to pronounce. So I should probably give a little bit of a backstory about how because we don't have this bird in Iowa. It's mostly found out west, and so I came across this bird when I was doing a study abroad in Montana, and that was probably one of the first few birds I saw, and I was like, oh my goodness, this bird is really cool, and that's how I discovered it. If I can move forward, there we go. So the Clark's nutcracker is part of the family Corvidae, which we have some of these species in Iowa. If if anyone is willing to put in the chat, or can you guys name out some of the birds that we have here? For example, this one in the top right. I'm pretty sure some people have seen it.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, and if you know what that bird is, you can just say it out loud.
And people see my cursor.
How
And
about
let's go.
American crow, Alder? Is that an American crow?
That is an American crow. And then we also have this one down here in Iowa. It's bottom left one. That is a blue jay. And then these three bottom ones on the center going right are some more that you'll find in the Western United States. We have a black-billed magpie, and we have a Steller's jay, and then this one's kind of mostly southwestern United States. So if you go to like Arizona, New Mexico, you'll more likely see that one. That one is a pinion jay. All of these birds, which really cool by the way, are in the family Corvidae. So I'm going to play you guys the sound of a Clark's nutcracker. It's about 16 seconds long and it's kind of a harsh sound, so be ready. And that is the sound of a Clark's nutcracker. Kind of cool, right? So, as I had not mentioned, they are mostly found in the western United States. Um, they are also found at different elevations, like way different than Ames, primarily between 3,000 feet and 12,000 feet. And the reason they do this is they really like colder weather, and so they'll go to these high altitudes to like to nest, to find food, and then they'll go to these lower altitudes when it's winter to find even more food. And just for a reference, Ames is only about 878 feet to about 1,000 feet, and so the places that the Clark's Nutcracker is found is way higher elevation than what we have here. So because of this, their elevation is usually in subalpine habitats and coniferous forests, which means pine trees. It's going to be a lot colder there. The water's going to be cleaner. And yeah, lots and lots of mountains. Something really cool about the Clark's Nutcracker is both parents will actually care for their offspring, and so they'll take turns gathering food, sitting on nests. It's a really interesting thing you don't see very often in the bird world. And the photo right here is a Clark's Nutcracker pair nesting in a Doug fir tree. Their diet primarily consists of nuts, fruits, and insects, and sometimes meat. They're pretty opportunistic feeders, so what that means is they will basically get whatever they can find. In this top left one, I believe that one found some food on the ground from like a suet feeder, kind of similar to what the one on the bottom left is standing on. The one in the top right has an insect, and then the bottom right one, it is picking a fight with I think it's a violet green swift. I can't see around the Zoom chat. But yeah. And then sometimes they can find things that aren't necessarily you wouldn't find in nature. But of course, their favorite food of all times is pine seeds, which is a really interesting thing because they are the primary ecological disperser of whitebark pine seeds. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the species in a second, but this pine tree is also found in their habitat at the really high elevations, and it's has a really interesting relationship with them, which I'll also talk about. So the whitebark pine, as aforementioned, is a subalpine species, and they're usually found at about 10,000 feet or above, preferably higher. And they're really, really old species. They live up beyond about 1,000 years. So for with the school bus for scale, they grow up to 40 to 60 feet, which is about 1 to 2 school buses, depending on. Now, the whitebark pine and the Clark's Nutcracker have a really interesting relationship called mutualism, which is a symbiotic relationship where they basically help each other. There's different types of relationships, but this is I help you and you help me. When the Clark's Nutcracker um, takes the seeds, they do this really interesting action called caching them, kind of like what squirrels do, where they take seeds and they store them for later usage. Sometimes they forget where to put them, and those eventually become trees. So for the whitebark pine, the Clark's Nutcracker helps them disperse the seeds, and therefore there are more pines. But for the seeds that the Clark's Nutcracker remembers to find, they get a really, really nice boost of nutrients because whitebark pine seeds are really heavy in nutrients. I should briefly mention up here that there's also an interesting evolutionary co they have grown to coexist with each other. Usually pines will disperse by wind, by water, any ways they can get their seeds. The whitebark pine specifically has developed means of dispersing by animals. So they'll have Clark's Nutcrackers doing it, they'll have bears doing it, but Clark's Nutcrackers can take them way further. Also, I may have drawn that little Nutcracker, so woohoo! So, as I've mentioned, the whitebark pine isn't actually doing so well. It's an endangered species in the Western United States, and that is primarily due to a bunch of diseases, primarily blister rust, which is caused by bark beetles burrowing into the trees. And when those beetles hatch, they leave holes, and then the fungus comes in and infects the trees, causing them to turn into this brown color, as you can see on the screen. This is all supposed to be green, but there's little patches of brown where these infected trees are. And a part of this is the rising temperatures. So the beetles that are doing this used to not be able to go into these subalpine areas. They need warmer climates, and so because temperatures are rising in mountains, beetles are able to go a lot higher, and they are affecting whitebark pine trees. And because these trees have never ever encountered them before, they don't really have a way to protect themselves, which also affects our buddies, the Clark's Nutcracker. Since the whitebark pine is their primary food source and probably the most nutritious, with the decline of whitebark pine, they don't really have that much food options in those high elevations, and so their primary food source is decreasing. They're also losing a lot of habitat because these stands are becoming infected, and if there's a whole bunch of dead pine trees, it's more or less susceptible to fires and just not very protective overall. And there's a lot of temperature stress for the birds because of the increasing temperatures. But as I have been researching, there is hope. There is a lot of people who care about the conservation efforts between Clark's Nutcrackers and whitebark pines. I've listed a few of the organizations I found down here, but hopefully with more research into the beetles, into the ecology of the Clark's Nutcracker, we can start to see changes in this conservation. And that is it for my presentation. Cool. Next up, I have an activity for people. Are you guys ready? Yes? Cool. All right. So, a little bit of backstory before we go into this activity. There's a whole bunch of talk within the American Ornithological Society, and they're thinking about renaming a whole bunch of birds. And what this is, we're mostly renaming the common names of the birds, like Cooper's hawk, in our case, the Clark's Nutcracker, but their scientific names will be the same. A little bit of why we're doing this is because we want to have a more accurate description of a bird. For example, a let's see, what's a good idea? A ring-necked pheasant, for example. The name tells you that it has a ringed neck, so it describes the bird a lot easier. But if you have something like a Clark's Nutcracker, what does that tell you about the bird? And so that's part of the reason why they're changing the names. And also, some of the people might not have been exactly good role models, and so there's talk about why we're changing them from that as well. In the case of the Clark's Nutcracker, the bird is named after the explorers Lewis and Clark, if you have heard about them in school. Lewis and Clark going on their expedition west, discovering they're trying to find a giant river, and they don't find it, but they still go adventuring. Oh yeah. My challenge for you guys, and you can work with your siblings or you can talk amongst yourself or think inside your head. What would you rename this bird?